Welcome to our 5-minute takeaway sessions presented by the Guild of Letting and Management. My name is Susie Crolla. I'm Managing Director of the Guild of Letting and Management. For this takeaway session, we're going to look at the way in which landlords and property professionals will have to fully rely on the Section 8 notice under the amendments introduced under the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, this marks a significant shift in favour of the tenant and security and procedural fairness. While landlords do actually retain the ability to regain possession of their properties, this must now be based on very clear, justifiable grounds with strict adherence to notice requirements and legal processes. The fact that Section 21, no-fault evictions, will be abolished means that landlords must now cite specific grounds under Section 8 to terminate a tenancy. What this does is place a much greater administrative and evidentiary burden on landlords, who must now demonstrate that one or more of the statutory grounds for possession are actually satisfied. Serve valid notice with prescribed information, ensuring strict compliance with legal forms and timelines. Prepare for potential court hearings, particularly where discretionary grounds are involved. Now, this obviously has an impact for landlords. And what this means is that there will be reduced flexibility in terminating tenancies without a justifiable cause. There will be increased reliance on legal representation and documentation to support possession claims. There is a potential for longer void periods due to court delays and tenant resistance due to discretionary possession claims. So we need to think very carefully about the revised and extended notice periods that will apply under the new statutory framework. The framework will introduce longer notice periods for most grounds. For example, the notice period will either be immediate notice, 2 weeks notice, 4 weeks notice, 2 months notice, or 4 months notice. And there is an impact. There will be operational delays in regaining possession, particularly if the situation is urgent. There may be an increased financial exposure due to prolonged non-payment of rent or non-compliance by tenants. And then it's important to factor into this that landlords may need to budget for extended tenancy periods even after serving notice. So what do the stricter requirements for the mandatory grounds look like? Now, while some of the grounds have been expanded, they also impose stricter conditions. For example, under grounds 1 and 1A, these may only be used if the tenancy has lasted for at least 1 year, and then 4 months' notice has to be given. There will be fewer situations in which mandatory grounds can be used effectively. And it's important to consider here that landlords may struggle to meet the evidential burden, particularly in cases of partial arrears or disputes over notice. Whilst the mandatory grounds seem relatively straightforward, we need to think about the discretionary nature of grounds. Now, there are a significant number of grounds under Section 8 that will remain discretionary, meaning that even if the ground is proven, the court may refuse to grant possession if it considers it to be unjust or if the tenant has mitigated their behaviour. This is particularly relevant if we're relying on ground 10, some rent arrears, and ground 11, persistent late rent, and then ground 14, antisocial behaviour. So there's a domino effect, and the effect is that landlords may need to provide supporting evidence, for example, statements from neighbours, rent schedules, incident logs. And the fact that there is greater court discretion means that the outcomes can vary significantly case by case. And then finally, we need to think about reputational and compliance risks. Now, this new regime is part of a much wider movement towards tenant protections. It introduces prohibitions on retaliatory eviction, preventing landlords from serving notice in response to tenant complaints or enforcement actions. The regime will also provide stricter local authority oversight and enforcement, and there will be mandatory registration under the landlord database. So, in short, landlords will face increased scrutiny from tenants and regulators. If they fail to follow the correct procedures, this could invalidate not only the notice, but also the possession claim, and therefore prolong tenancy disputes. Now, non-compliance could result in penalties, bans, or reputational damage for the landlord. And it's also important to factor the financial consequences. The amendments will likely, most definitely, have the following financial implications for landlords. There'll be delays in regaining possession, which means longer periods without rental income. There will be higher legal and administrative costs due to more complex possession procedures, and the potential increases in landlord insurance premiums as insurers reassess the risks associated with evictions. So finally, it's important to think about the strategic adjustments for landlords. They need to mitigate these impacts. Landlords need to think very carefully about screening tenants more thoroughly to reduce the risk of arrears or antisocial behaviour. They need to consider and ensure that they have rigorous documentation, excellent record keeping, especially around rent payments, complaints and tenancy breaches. It would be important to think about using the services of a professional property management service provider to stay compliant with legal obligations. In conclusion, landlords who adapt to this new framework in a very proactive way by improving tenant relations, maintaining compliance, and seeking legal advice much earlier wherever necessary will be better positioned to operate successfully in this reformed rental market. Thank you for listening to today's session. For further information on the services we offer, head over to our website and subscribe to our channel. I look forward to seeing you next time.